I've never considered myself particularly attractive. I certainly don't have big tits, a big round ass, ballerina legs, or hair shiny enough for a shampoo commercial. And unlike Helen of Troy, my face wouldn't launch 1,000 ships. Despite this, I have received a lot of male attention over the years. Maybe it's because I have an open and friendly face, and I'm always kind to everyone, regardless of the reason, after a man called me attractive or some synonym. For about the 50th time, I admitted that there was something about me that attracted guys. It never crossed my mind, and I continued to be friendly and nice to everyone I came into contact with, even some people who probably didn't notice. By the way, my maiden name was Elizabeth Wharton, and my newly adopted married name was Elizabeth Tipton. I got married when I was 23 to Gary Tipton, a guy I met in my first year of law school, while he was a graduate student in business school. Like many guys, Gary thought I was attractive but could never tell me why. He's pleasant, almost never shows a bad mood, although he played hockey in college, which is a rough sport, is good-looking, outwardly honest and smart, and did very well in business school. He pursued me more aggressively than others before him, and perhaps that's why I fell in love with him. At least that's how I felt. I never had that flushed, anxious, intense feeling that some of my girlfriends had, or at least said they did about their dates, but I just chalked it up to my calmer personality. Gary and I were planning a 10-day honeymoon in Hawaii. The first 7 days were great, laying on the beach, going to dance clubs. We both loved dancing, drinking foo-foo drinks with umbrellas in them, and having leisurely sex. At day 8, we were in the local, i.e. Nantoristi, part of Honolulu, next to a somewhat run-down park. I don't even remember why we were there. Gary was the one who suggested it, even though I was wary of it. While I was sitting on the park bench, Gary went to get some ice cream since it was a hot day. He had only been gone for about a minute when I saw a couple of burly guys staring at me. I almost ran after Gary but decided I was just being paranoid. I realized that my paranoia was justified when they began to approach me as soon as Gary was out of sight. I didn't see the third guy coming from the opposite direction of the first two until he grabbed me. Suddenly, all three of them pulled me towards the car with the door open. The only thing they said was, "Don't resist, bitch, or you'll get hurt." And at least one of them slapped me when I screamed. I was unsuccessfully trying to stop them from putting me in the back seat of the car when I heard a groan and a crack, and one guy let me go. Suddenly, things became very violent, and I felt my head hit the car and I collapsed to the ground in pain, bordering on delirium. One of my eyes was quickly swollen shut and I was having trouble thinking clearly. But as far as I could tell, some big blonde guy was fighting two thugs while a third lay motionless on the ground. One of the thugs landed on top of me, apparently unconscious, and I instinctively pushed him away from me just in time to see the big blonde guy snap the neck of the third guy, who went completely limp and fell to the ground. The big blonde guy literally threw off the bandit who was lying on top of me and then asked in a gentle voice, "Are you okay?" I guess my answer was garbled because he got a concerned look on his face. Then he picked me up like I weighed nothing and carried me to his car. He carefully placed me in the front passenger seat and buckled me in. He went a rag with water from a bottle and gently wiped my forehead over my swollen eye and somehow took out a bandage. I think from the first aid kit, although I didn't see it, and placed it over the obvious cut above my left eye. He disappeared for a short time, put my purse on my lap and said, "I'll take you to the hospital." I saw him playing with his phone, apparently getting directions to the nearest hospital, and then we were on our way. During the trip, I drifted in and out of consciousness. When I was conscious, I remember looking at his face and thinking, this is the most handsome guy I've ever seen in my life, and I admired his broad shoulders and big biceps. He asked me a lot of questions, obviously trying to wake me up since I was told in high school health class that if someone has a head injury, you should try to keep them awake. All I remember were the questions. Did my rings mean I was married? Where was my husband? And what did he look like? I think I gave the right answers. I realized this when he pulled up to the hospital emergency room. When he came to pull me out of his car, he said, "I would appreciate it if you wouldn't tell anyone that I killed 2 of the 3 guys who attacked you. And please tell them that you don't remember anything about me." I'm sure I muttered an inaudible okay. And as he lifted me into his strong arms, I buried my face, thankfully with my good eyes, into his chest and pressed myself as tightly as I could. There was a lot of commotion in the emergency room. I noticed a staff member take my purse. A big blonde guy carefully put me on a gurney and I held out my hand to him. "Thank you," "I don't even know your name," I said in a moment of enlightenment, grabbing his hand. "My name doesn't matter," he smiled. A smile that lit up the dim corridor of the emergency room with the light of a million-candle halogen lamp. "Just call me Jude," and it was an honor to help such an attractive girl. I seemed to fall into unconsciousness as I felt the gurney move from its place. I ended up with a severe concussion as well as a swollen left eye and a cut above it that required several stitches. Gary apparently arrived, although I drifted in and out of consciousness, so I was never sure in about 3 hours. His cell phone number was on the emergency contact list in my purse, and he got a call from the hospital. When I first noticed Gary was in my hospital room. There were 2 other guys with him. They introduced themselves as Honolulu detectives and were in plain clothes. They asked me several questions. All I could tell them was that 3 guys attacked me and hurt me, and that some big blonde guy who told me to call him Jude protected me. But I didn't know anything else. I described the 3 attackers as best I could, which wasn't very good, but I heard one of the detectives say to the other, "Obviously 2 dead guys and a hospitalized man, whom we found at the open car door." I declined further questioning, and Gary told them that if I remembered anything else, he would call them. And then I drifted off to sleep, or possibly passed out. I remember when I was in some state of delirium. I had vivid dreams so vivid that when I passed out, I thought for a few seconds that they were real about a big blonde handsome guy, while I was in ecstasy making out with having sex with him in all imaginable positions and places. His face, broad shoulders, and biceps were imprinted on my brain with a brilliance I had never experienced before. Because of my concussion, Gary and I had to be delayed a day before doctors cleared me to fly back to the mainland. And even then, I had to take medications that made me drowsy. Gary and I talked about this incident. He told me that when he returned with the ice cream, I was gone. And he saw a car next to 3 bodies and called 911 the way he spoke. And some details puzzled me, as did his inability to look me in the eyes for more than a second when he talked to me about it. But I just chalked it up to my condition. Before I left the hospital, I saw 2 nurses who were there when I checked in. It turns out that they were there and are glad to see that I came to my senses. I asked them about Jude. Apparently one of the nurses tried her best to hit on him, but he politely turned her down. I pumped as much information out of them as I could, but they didn't really know any more than I did. However, they confirmed that this dude is 1.5 hunks. A month after returning home, I was almost completely normal and doing as well in law school as I had before the inside end, as I euphemistically called it. I truly received a lot of compassion and care from family and friends. Only to my best friend did I describe what Jude looked like and the vivid, realistic dreams I had about him. She studied psychology in college and identified it as a hero worship complex. I didn't tell anyone that I thought about him every day. One of the results of the incident was that it left a small scar near my lefty brow. It was lightly covered with makeup and completely unnoticeable from a distance, or when I was wearing sunglasses. However, whenever I noticed it in the mirror, instead of remembering the bad part of the incident, I thought about Jude. Gary got his master's degree. I got my law degree, and we both got good jobs. He had an intellectual property law firm, and him at a startup internet company. After about 5 years of marriage, things were going well for us in many ways, but sometimes I had a strange feeling of emptiness. I would call our marriage comfortable because we never fought. We had many common interests, a good lifestyle, and a good collection of mutual friends. However, I eventually admitted to myself that I was not sexually satisfied, and my vivid dream of Jude having sex with me repeated a couple of times a month was very disturbing and depressing. I went with Frank Fitzsimmons, a partner in my law firm, to visit a new client in a city about 200 miles away. The new client was a relatively large engineering company, Kinetic Force, which had several inventions that they wanted to patent. A female receptionist led us into a spacious, ornate conference room. It was obvious that Kinetic Force was a very successful company, and we were soon joined by Jim, the company's president, and Kate, their in-house paralegal. After a few pleasantries, Jim said our chief engineer Dirk Van Vliet will join us soon. Despite our success, we are newbies when it comes to intellectual property. So while we wait, why don't you give us a rundown of general information about trademarks and copyrights? In a controlled business-like manner, I began to present all sorts of general information and answer Kate and Jim's questions as they came. About 15 minutes after my story, the door opened, and a guy I assumed was named Dirk walked in. My chatter stopped. My heart has stopped. My brain stopped functioning properly. I think I hear Jim say, "Oh, Lisbeth and Frank, this is Dirk Van Vliet." I had our chief engineer. It was Jury, there was no mistake in this. His appearance was burned into my brain. When I heard his voice, all shadows of doubt disappeared, the look of recognition on his face. When he shook my hand, took away even that little bit. And when I touched his hand, the electric shock that went from my brain down was one of the most powerful feelings of my life, so strong that I trembled. Dirk Jude came to his senses faster than I did and actually chatted with Frank for a few minutes, while I looked at him in awe, hopefully without drooling. And Frank asked me a technical question. I finally snapped out of my stupor and engaged in semi-intelligent conversation for the next 20 minutes or so. Then, to my delight and horror, Jim said, "Lisbeth, why don't you go with Dirk to the prototype floor and then to his office to discuss the mechanical device we are interested in patenting it, while Kate will take Frank to the laboratory to look at the electrical devices we are developing." Frank and I didn't really talk when we went out to look at the prototype he had developed. When we got there, he explained it to me. It was relatively simple, albeit ingenious, and given my mechanical engineering degree, I had no trouble figuring it out. I took a few notes and photos and asked a few questions. When we finished, he said, "I have engineering drawings of the device in my office," when I followed him into his office. We again spoke very little. I closed the door behind me and began to shake. "You are the same Jude," I muttered. There was silence for a good minute as we looked at each other. I was shaking. "I've thought about you a lot over the past 5 years," he said softly. "You are the most seductive woman I have ever seen." When he said this, a feeling came over me that I had never experienced before. Most likely, it was a combination of lust, passion, hunger, and madness. I walked up to him, pulled his head to mine, and kissed him with a ferocity that both surprised and stunned me. He responded in kind. He ran our hands over our bodies more in a trance than in reality. I felt his strong arms turn me around and push me so that my hands were on his table. I had never had such bright, hot, and passionate sex before that moment. I temporarily lost consciousness. I came to my senses when Dirk turned me towards him at the same time, lifting my panties into place. After a few quick kisses to different parts of my neck and face, he muttered, "I'm really sorry, Lisbeth." I didn't let him finish, but I do not. I dreamed about this for 5 years, only to discover that the reality is even better than the fantasy. We have to pull ourselves together before we see anyone, he said. "But all I want to do is make love to you." He said, "Make love to you." I was happy. Over the next 15 minutes, we regained as much composure as possible and made a plan for Frank to return that night and for me to stay the night. Apparently at Dirk's house, I learned that his wife died 2 years ago from a brain aneurysm. He asked shyly, "Do you think about your husband?" I think my answer shocked him. Right now, I can't think about anything other than you having hot sex with me. I've never cheated before, but I can't ignore how I feel about you and have been feeling for the last 5 years. I didn't lie to Gary when I called him to tell him I was staying the night. I told him I am discussing a number of things with the inventor of a device that I will help patent. And all this is absolutely true. I think Gary sensed something was wrong, but he didn't question further, and there was no expression of affection when I said goodbye. The night at Dirk's house was the best night of my life. It seemed that we connected on some higher level. I felt more comfortable with him than with anyone else in my life. Our nightly bacchanalia exceeded my wildest dreams. For the better part of 12 hours, I was in a constant state of euphoria, and I had feelings stronger than those I had for Gary. About halfway through the night, I realized that although I had always been comfortable with Gary, I didn't love him because I didn't know what love was until my time with Dirk. After the night I spent with Dirk, my marriage was over. Although this was not a difficult decision to begin with, it was made easier by what Dirk told me about Gary during the incident. Dirk said he saw Gary come around the corner of the building with 2 ice cream cones while 3 guys were attacking me, then abandoned them and ran away. At first I couldn't believe it. Although Dirk had no reason to lie, I was clearly already his if he wanted me. When I remembered Gary's strange conversations with me about the kidnapping attempt and realized that he felt guilty when he talked to me about it, so he couldn't look me in the eyes. I remembered that his story often changed in minor details when he talked about this to others, and some of the things he said never rang true. When I returned home after spending the night at Dirk's house, the first thing I did was ask Gary about the details of the incident, from his discomfort in talking about it, including completely stopping the conversation after a couple of minutes. I knew that Dirk was telling the truth. I didn't tell Gary who I was leaving him for. I never mentioned Jude or anything else about Hawaii after my initial questions about it. But 2 days after I got back and after hours of phone conversations with Dirk, I sat Gary down. I didn't use the "we need to talk" cliché, especially because I wasn't going to have a discussion that implied we need to talk. I said directly, "Gary, these last few days have made me realize for the first time that I have never been in love with you the way a woman should be in love with her husband. I realized what love is only in the last few days. I am filing for divorce before the end of the week because I'm in love for the first time." Gary tried to talk me out of it. He was upset by my reluctance to share details. He got angry when I told him that the night on the trip was the first time I cheated on him, but I don't regret it in the slightest. He called me names that at one time in my life would have really hurt me, but currently didn't mean shit to me. That same night I went and stayed at a hotel. By the end of the week I had taken the few things I needed from our house and either sent them to Dirk's house or put them in my car. I held for divorce and served Gary, told everyone in the family that I was divorcing Gary because I had fallen in love with someone else, and made an agreement with my law firm that I could work remotely, only coming into the office once a month. For the next 6 months, after which they could either fire me or resign if the arrangement doesn't work out. And that once we part ways, I won't approach any of their clients, with the exception of Kinetic Force, which will be my client. I got the distinct impression that many people who knew Gary and I considered me a traitor and hoped that my new relationship would fail or that I would end up with a venereal disease. Fortunately for them, at least until now, 10 years after I filed for divorce, none of this has happened. I have now been Mrs. Lisbeth Van Vliet for over 9 years. I'm madly in love with my husband and make love to him every chance I get and enjoy a fulfilling life, raising our 2 children and working part-time as an intellectual property attorney in a small firm in my new city. Maybe I shouldn't have gotten married until I found someone I truly fell in love with. But then again, I didn't know what true love was until Dirk Van Vliet saved me. Subscribe to our channel, listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.